Alright, so I wanted to do a video as I'm in the middle of this kind of modification project here from the original design setup. So on the intake, the original setup is to use this 1/2 inch ring on the intake itself. The intake itself, this 3/8 lip is part of that ring, cast into it and cut out. And then the grate is bolted on top of that. This lip here is 3/8, this is 1/2 inch. So you put the 1/2 inch on, which is supposed to be flush with the bottom of the boat. Then you have 3/8 sticking out. And this 1/2 inch ring is what they use for the UHMW applications. So this would be sticking out below the boat, requiring you to use the UHMW. So, take away that option essentially with this setup. So the other option they give is a 3/4 inch intake ring that raises us up to be flush with the bottom of the boat, so that you have the grate at the same level, with the bottom of the boat. I've had a lot of people tell me, well, you really need to raise that, get the grate off the bottom of the boat so you're not jamming rocks into it and so on. It seemed reasonable, when you start out and you're basically just taking the advice of the people you're buying things from and assuming that, hey, this is all good, they know what they're doing. Not to say that they don't entirely, but you don't know of all the issues that are going to come along with it up front. So obviously the biggest issue I had was the motor sat so low in the boat that I had to take the original 1/2 inch ring and raise it as much as possible to try and get enough clearance just to put the motor in. And even with those mounts, they had to be on the bottom of the boat after I raised the original ring. They still had to be on the bottom of the boat to use the original mounts. You still have very little clearance because there's divots in the oil pan for those. So you're just really putting that motor down to the very bottom of the boat with no clearance. And so that's probably reason enough to raise your ring, other than the grate just maybe not being a good idea to be flush with the bottom of the boat. So I went ahead and took out the original ring, ordered this 1.5 inch square bar last week. Received it, got it cut up. I did 45s in the corners here and then beat it out really deep, probably 1/2 inch in the middle that's not welded. Welded it all the way around, cut them down to size. I ended up buying a skill saw blade to cut the aluminum. Wasn't ideal. It worked. Wasn't a problem. There's a lot of grinding after the fact, just for the corners if nothing else, but also just getting everything squared up, lined up, using the original intake ring as a pattern. Obviously I still haven't drilled the holes in the intake ring yet. Looks like, this is 1.5 inches thick. I really don't want to put the bolts on the bottom. This is going to now be flush with the bottom of the boat. So, you'd have to countersink your heads if you didn't want the heads sticking out. I'm still planning on using the UHMW, but I have the option not to. I may not at first. I really don't know. Have to think ahead a little bit on that one. So rather than drilling holes through the entire ring up into the intake and using the original 1/4-20 bolts, I'm probably going to upsize the bolts to either 5/16 or 3/8 and drill from the top. Now the issue with that is that you do have mounting bolts on the back side, and of course your intake is covering that from the top side. So you can end up with having to drill from the bottom to get those bolts in anyway back here. But I still believe, for me it's preferable to have the bolts on the top otherwise. So at least it'll reduce the countersunk heads on these bolts to some extent. So I'm going to have approximately, I believe, 3/4 of an inch higher on the intake than a little more than that than I originally would have. So my engine will come up high enough to where I can put those mounts on a carriage, have some clearance underneath, have the engine bearers being what supports the engine without being on the bottom of the boat, which seems to be, the proper way to do it from what I'm hearing. So, that's an improvement. I'll have some clearance underneath. The pump will be a little bit higher than it originally would have been. Performance-wise, I don't know that 3/4 of an inch is going to be a performance killer by any means. You've got the trim and all that. I just don't see it being a big problem. And so many people are telling me, bring it 2 inches off the bottom. Well, 2 inches, you got to raise your pump to do that. So anyway, since I had the hole in the back already cut, and then modified to try and fit a little bit higher and all that, I just decided to go ahead and cut this whole section out. And I just went ahead and went up like 21 inches because, I had the metal for it, and it was kind of a scrap piece where I just cut these small pieces off of it to make this. This is the clear cut that I had to make a rectangular cut. I went as wide as I could here. It was reasonable for what I had. I didn't see a reason to go wider. That's 1/4 inch plate, so it's thicker than this wall, which makes it easier to weld if nothing else. Because you have a thicker piece to a thinner piece, and you can focus your heat on the thicker piece as you weld up. Get good penetration and all that on both sides. One thing to note is I wanted a little bit more width back here than the piece I was originally going to use, which was a little bit narrower and shorter, which would have worked. And it was like 3/16, so it was still thicker than this, but not much. But you do have, your steering cable has to come in like right down here, and it's just off to the side of your intake adapter that goes on the outside, the Yamaha adapter. And you're going to need like a 5/8 hole with like an 1.25 inch washer is what comes with them. And you have to, make that seal as well. So I just wanted a little bit more width here. I figured, well, why not? It's just a little bit thicker metal. So I still need to drill and tap the holes on this, do through and through on the bottoms, on the backside, for the bolts to go on the bottom. And then, of course, countersink the heads, which I'm not really sure how I'm going to do yet. If I want a nice flat countersink, I'm going to have to take it into somebody. So, this intake ring issue, cost me probably a week and a half so far, And, if I was building a boat again and I had all this information, I would do this right up front. I probably wouldn't buy their 1/2 inch intake ring even if I was planning on using the UHMW. I like having the option of not having UHMW and not having a boat that I shouldn't put in the water. So personally, I think that's kind of a design flaw. I'm glad the motor's coming up, making it easier to build my mounts, get them off the bottom, use the original factory setup on how the motor was mounted. But in addition to all that, one thing I'm looking at is over here is where your exhaust chamber would be. On the original boat, motor in the middle, exhaust comes off to the side. Now what I've been told is that, well, I need to cut 5 inches or so off of that exhaust to make it fit inside the boat. Well, I'm one of those guys that likes to keep things factory just because, they spend millions and millions of dollars on research and development and, to provide a warranty and all that stuff. I tend to like things being factory. I don't know that cutting your exhaust way down, and reducing the side of that chamber is detrimental in any way. But I prefer to actually use the original. Well, the original exhaust, with the way where this is set up, is going to protrude through the transom probably 4.5 inches from what I can tell. So I'm actually thinking about cutting this out, building a box here, and part of that reason is because of that trim unit, trim box. Because the trim box, to be in its original position, would be out here as well. You have the trim box and the exhaust, so which are pretty close together. So I'd really like to keep the trim and everything as originally set up. This one's all electronics, it's got like 12 wires going to it. I don't know if you can get away with going mechanical on that without having code issues and computer problems. Like that box probably has to be hooked up for different reasons. So I'm probably gonna end up cutting that out, building a box out here, you know, and most likely this is going to destroy the option of the swim deck. So if you're looking at buying the boat and the swim deck, something else you need to consider is, are you just going to go with the modified exhaust, or do you want to stick with the original exhaust, try and you know, you're going to have to make modifications if that's the case. You know, whether it's wise or not, I don't know. I don't think it's unwise to stick with what the factory set up. You know, so you know, plan on keeping the boat long term, prefer the reliability, you know, original design over a modified design that I really don't know what the effect of is, even though it might be minimal or none. I'm not just going for every horsepower I can get out of it. So anyway, that's kind of the next modification. Is probably going to set me back weeks. Just like this one did, you know. I got weekends and evenings for a couple hours, so I'm not cutting off the fins for the swim deck until I get to the point where I have to. You know, I also wanted to look into a skid plate for the pump. You know, this thing only sticks out like 4 inches or so out the back, and your pump comes out. You know, and if you're so worried about, you know, rocks getting plugged into the intake screen that we need to raise it, you know, if you're jumping over crap, especially logs and whatnot, log comes off the back of that, boat goes down, bam, you're on your pump. So, you know, I don't know how much that I'll be doing, but you know, it's possible that this thicker 1/4 inch plate may end up turning into some sort of a you know, a bracing system for a skid plate. You know, this isn't something someone designs for you, tells you how to do, or you buy with the kit. So it's just some more things to consider. So, you know, possibly in a week or so I'll be moving forward on another section of this. You know, I have to remount the pump to the new transom piece. You know, get it bolted on, get it all lined up perfectly, get the intake ring adjusted so the pump matches the transom, you know, and then I can move forward with welding, possibly flipping the boat, you know, once I have that intake ring where I know it's going to be. So anyway, later.